And what came about was sort of an interest in starting with what we might think of in design or human-computer interaction as a canon of research through design, people that have been framing these issues and this phrasing of research and design together, such as Christopher Frayling, Niagara Cross, and others like Solomon, more recently, Peter Wright. So we have a sort of a framing of some of the early work that has used that phrase, and then built into topics the students chose, and these are just a selection of some of the papers that are coming out of this class. So you can see there's a very wide range. Most of you, a lot of you are in the class, so you already have deep familiarity with this. And then just to give a brief introduction to our panelists, you might have seen in the email going out, Lisa Ma is coming to us from London. She describes herself as socializing activism, creating farmification with workers, joystick factories in Shenzhen, spa experiences at cat ladies' homes in London, and political movements with vegetarians to eat instead of poison invasive animals in Belgium. So she wants to make activism iterative, innovative, or reflective, like a design process. Tad Hirsch, many of you know, our top guy, assistant professor coming from interaction design. I might curtail your intro, but leading the public practice studio, multidisciplinary public interest design group. And David Hendry is coming to us from the Information School, University of Washington. He's investigating tools, practices, and systems that create the conditions for sustainable, inclusive participation in design and information systems. And Ryan Johnson is an associate professor, Department of Architecture at the University of Washington, where he teaches courses in digital media and design computing next quarter as well. We'll probably be seeing some of you in our responsive environments course. And finally, our discussant who joined us after sabbatical, luckily enough, we snagged her, Batya Freeman, who has done a lot of work in values of design, found value-sensitive design as a research framework, and has been part of a professor at the Information School, adjunct professor in computer science, and here at the Human Design Engineering Department. So thank you to all of the panelists, and I want to just begin by sharing our first question for today, which is, how does design inform, shape, or factor into your research? So for some of us, design might be the core practice that we're involved in, so this then becomes a challenge to answer, but putting this out there as like a case of what we're trying to inform is what kinds of constructs of research design become important to our work. And I will start now with our first panelist. So Lisa is going to show us some of her work in response to this question.
So I was a bit, oh gosh, hi. If you can hear me, there's no need.
Okay.
It's fine. Yeah. Yeah, so I just heard no talk, and that's sad. But yeah, I kind of thought everyone was going to do a little introduction. Okay. Right.
You don't know that we're not. Yeah.
Hello, Seattle. I'm from London. So I do a thing called speculative design, and I design dilemmas, and I use these design dilemmas to work with different communities and get the wider public to think of a different process about progress and technology. So one of these projects is working with activists that were protesting against airport expansions. So not only were they, normally you probably think about people complaining about noise levels, but they were trying to halt this sprawling progress from Heathrow Airport to spread into neighbouring villages. And what they wanted to preserve was that some of these villages were ironically the things that tourists would come into London for. For example, where, say, Charles Dickens got the name Scrooge, where some of the oldest barns are. And actually, from their perspective, I started to understand that, this. So I have this thing about being stranded in airports. I actually quite like it. I'm like, well, this is where I can work away. This is where I can get a lot of my stuff done. And at this time, they were at MIT from Rob Kitchen and Martin Dodger. They were starting to bring out a term called coded spaces, where are you familiar with like non-spaces? That's kind of like the traditional sense that these transient places we just go in and out. But coded spaces are essentially how these places are only okay when the software actually works. So, for example, in Heathrow Airport, if say there was a system crash down, this is how we become stranded. It would simply be a bot of very, very angry people. It would actually be a hindrance to society after all. So I dug out every single historian I could find in the local area, including this one, who, so now I can talk about it, he's retired, but basically he had all the restricted maps for Heathrow. So when it was built in the first place, he could find where all the Roman remains and these really interesting maps of where the first ever chartering processes started. And we created a historic village tour for stranded passengers, and these would be run by airport activists. So internationally, these are also growing in different airports, in different places. So the process about how design becomes research is really about how design can help a community move from a state of passivism towards a state of activism through a dilemma. So the next thing was I went to stay in a joystick factory in Shenzhen, like the factories that would make our joysticks. At the same time, this is when I'd be sort of giving talks when the whole gestural input devices were coming out, and also Foxconn was having these big sort of news headlines about how there was millions of factory workers and how much they were being underpaid. And I thought, okay, well let's look at the human perspective, the human scale of it, rather than look at them from economic value or a mass scale, and look at what do they eat for lunch, how do they protest against, for example, some of these at lunchtime. They would protest against a Sichuan chef who cooks really spicy food. So all the girls would pick up the chilies and put them into little mountains. So after it's all gone, there would be a protest of these little mountains of chilies. And how would a migrant worker watch their favorite soap? And it's not a very small community. At the time, it was this is 2011. So at the time, it was 230 million migrant workers. That's like 3/4 of the US population. So if they're watching a soap, that's, if you think about how TV companies measure it, how do these people watch things when they're moving around? So different shops would actually put on different channels across the same street, and you would, literally pick your favorite one. That would be your huddle, and every 12 minutes when there's an advert, everyone gets back to their business again, only to reunite to finish. And then at the end of a working day, they would come to these unisex dormitories to share the evening. And what's really interesting is that a lot of these workers were smuggling in spider plants and different sort of species that they were growing. And in the weekends, they would actually go over to the nearby abandoned lands. And the thing is, these migrant workers, they used to be farmers who'd left their lands behind. And if you ask them, they're very skilled at knowing how different species grow, and it kind of gets you thinking that now that we're demanding so much technology, what's its impact on the global food crisis? Every year, China's importing more and more food, and this is creating political tension. This is because we're needing the same number of people to make our gadgets. And also, the irony is that they were moving into this gestural input device, and everyone was kind of on the edge of their seats, and that's why they invited me in the first place, because they felt trapped. They were being kind of at the fringes by the very products they were manufacturing. And it was kind of a funny panic. At the same time, I'd probably go and give a presentation to Microsoft and go, oh, you guys are designing out my factory workers, and these guys are going, what is this connect we're hearing? what's our next step? So I convinced the factory bosses. So normally what they would have to do is keep on feeding the same amount of work until they would go bust and fire everyone. So every summer they would hire more people because that's when the products get made for our Christmases in the US. So I convinced the factory worker to, the boss to allow the workers to do part-time farming just down the road in their downtimes. And this was able to create a little economy and also to kind of deal with this isolation that some of the workers were feeling from moving from these big open lands into shared dormitories. And then in 2012, a year later, this is when big iron factories, some of the biggest iron factory in Wuhan in China, they were also suffering from the property bubble burst. And they started to invest about $6.4 billion into things like pig farming, to their kind of farmification. And
Please, I don't want to cut you off.
oh, okay, okay, we'll just, yeah, really fast. All right,
yeah.
Theme park, abandoned, farming, locals reclaiming land. This is how activism is done when you're not allowed to do activism and an emergent pattern happens. Blah, blah, blah.
Oh.
Collectivism, how to use design dilemmas to get it to work. Invasive species, vegetarian town. They spend like millions of euros doing that. And then basically they have different processes of killing animals, but dealing with the problem that they need to be vegetarians, and creating local experts, bringing TV stations into science labs, and then getting government processes. This is a zombie pie that we created to launch the Food Council. So from knotweeds, which is very invasive, you can't sell your house if there's a knotweed in your road, and you can't kill them, so you have to heat them up.
I hope he understands that this actually has a lot of political significance. Also, the fact that if you direct...
So basically, it's a reality TV show right now in Ghent, in Belgium. This is the mayor of Ghent, and sort of I fed him this invasive goose. So now that so it's a policy level thing, and they're allowing their geese to instead of being poisoned and injected with poison and then hold back for incineration, that they were going to feed it instead to the locals for this vegetarian town. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks.
Anyone else? Let's look back. Yes, with that. I'll let you step in.
Sure, okay. So, question was, how does design inform, shape, or factor into your research? So I'm a designer. I work in a design division. It's pretty central. I'm not used to, it's interesting for me to think about the question this way. We spend so much of our time asking the inverse question, where does research factor into our design? And I think research was actually, I wish we had more time, right? But one of the things that does strike me is that so much of, I think, the research activity that we engage in.
Can you speak louder?
I don't know. I can try.
Oh, do you want this?
I think so much of the research activity that we engage in design is highly contextual, highly specific, and defies generalization. And I think that's a good thing. And I think there's a tension here between the way designers engage in research and knowledge production and the way that other fields would like to engage in knowledge production. So for me, I think we make a distinction between research that's done in the service of design activity, which is, again, highly contextualized, highly specific, and we expect there to be a discussion, if you will, between projects that is mediated by the artifacts themselves, and that is a discussion that happens largely through inspiration rather than argumentation. the end goal, the way that we influence the field is by making things that hopefully inspire other people to make other things, but we're not necessarily trying to instill a sense of best practice or we're not we expect there to be this kind of bumping up knowledge bases rather than I think everyone trying to push together to create this kind of agreed upon master set of information. So that might be a quick thoughts on it.
So, I guess